Welcome back, everyone. Here we are with Ways of the World, a brief global history with sources. We're going to continue our study of milestones of the past century, a changing global landscape, with East versus West, a global divide, and a Cold War. So let's start with military conflict and the Cold War. Now, Europe was the Cold War's first arena. Soviets had concern for security and wanted control of Eastern Europe, and the American and British desired for open societies that were linked to the capitalist world economy. And that led to the creation of rival military alliances, NATO in 1949 and the Warsaw Pact in 1955. The American sphere of influence in Western Europe was largely voluntary, while the Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe was heavily imposed. Thus, the quote-unquote Iron Curtain divided the two spheres. Communism also spread in Asia, particularly China, Korea, and Vietnam, and that caused conflict. North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, and with the Vietnamese, there was massive U.S. intervention in the 1960s that did not go well for the United States. A major Cold War-era conflict also took place in Afghanistan. A Marxist party took power in 1978, but soon alienated much of the population. So then the Soviet military intervened in 1979, and for the next 10 years, and they met little success. The USSR finally withdrew in 1989 under enormous international pressure, and that led to the communist rule of Afghanistan collapsing. So let's talk about Cuba, the battle that never happened. Fidel Castro came to power in the early 1960s, and there's U.S. hostility toward the communist outposts in Cuba that led to Khrushchev sending nuclear weapons to Cuba, and thus the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. This is a major standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union over Soviet deployment of nuclear weapons or missiles in Cuba. The confrontation ended in compromise, with the USSR removing its missiles in exchange for the United States agreeing not to invade Cuba. And we didn't. All right, the global Cold War. So the Cold War witnessed a sharp division between the communist world and the Western democratic world. It also divided the continent of Europe, the countries of China, Korea, Vietnam, and Germany, and the city of Berlin. In many places, it also sparked crises that brought the nuclear-armed superpowers of the United States and the USSR to the brink of war, although in every case they managed to avoid direct military conflict between themselves. Many countries in Africa and Asia claimed membership in a non-aligned movement that sought to avoid entanglements in Cold War conflicts. So let's look at this map. Identify the two continents that contain the greatest number of neutral countries. And what effects did the Cold War have on these regions? Well, South America and Africa appear neutral on the map, which did not mean that the Cold War did not affect them. The United States and the USSR tried to gain influence within different countries so they could gain access to the natural wealth there. Countries such as South Africa were closely aligned with the United States, whereas countries such as Ethiopia were closely aligned with the USSR. Other countries such as Chile and Egypt changed sides either as a diplomatic strategy or as a result of a change in leadership. Still, other nations such as Angola or Mozambique were torn by brutal civil wars in which one side aligned with the United States and the other with the USSR. In what different ways was the Cold War experienced by the members of NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and non-aligned nations? Well, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was a voluntary alliance that created a voluntary sphere of influence. In fact, states like France came and went from NATO during the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact was largely imposed, and member states were coerced, often by force, to remain. Conversely, the non-aligned nations often dealt with decolonization, and in this context, became battlegrounds between competing groups that embraced either communism or capitalism that, depending on the country's geostrategic position, might lead to intervention by one of the superpowers. All right, nuclear standoff and Third World rivalry. Now, the USSR succeeded in acquiring nuclear weapons in 1949, and that led to a massive arms race. By 1989, the world had nearly 60,000 nuclear warheads with complex delivery systems. In that 40-year period, there's a massive fear of nuclear destruction and even the possible extinction of humankind. Both sides knew how serious their destructive power was, and there's careful avoidance of nuclear provocation, especially after 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's also avoidance of any direct military confrontation, though they both continued to build arsenals. And the United States and the USSR courted third world countries. The United States intervened in Iran, the Philippines, Guatemala, El Salvador, Chile, the Congo, and elsewhere because of fear of communist penetration. The United States often supported corrupt, authoritarian regimes if they opposed communists. Many third world countries resisted being used as pawns, and some countries, for example, India, claimed quote-unquote non-alignment status during the Cold War. And some tried to play the superpowers against each other. All right, the hydrogen bomb. So during the 1950s and early 1960s, tests in the atmosphere of ever larger and more sophisticated hydrogen bombs made images of enormous fireballs and mushroom-shaped clouds the universal symbol of these weapons, which were immensely more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. And this is the American test pictured here that took place in 1957. How might the widespread development of nuclear weapons have prevented direct conflict between the United States and Soviet Union in the Cold War era? Well, given the awesome power of nuclear weaponry, which by the 1960s were hundreds of times more potent than the ones that killed thousands in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, both the United States and the Soviet Union were incredibly reticent to use them. That being said, they realized that any direct conflict between them, even one that began conventionally, would escalate to nuclear warfare. As such, they avoided direct conflict, especially after the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. All right, Fidel Castro. Here he is fighting in the mountains of Cuba in 1957. Quote, "You Americans must realize that Cuba means to us old Bolsheviks," end quote, declared a high-ranking Soviet official in 1960. Quote, "We have been waiting for all our lives for a country to go communist without the Red Army. It's happened in Cuba and it makes us feel like boys again," end quote. The triumph of the Cuban revolutionaries must have been exhilarating for communists everywhere because it occurred in such an unlikely place. Located just 90 miles from Florida, Cuba had been a virtual protectorate of the United States in the decades following its independence from Spain in 1902. Moreover, U.S. companies had long exerted considerable influence over the weakly corrupt Cuban government and dominated key sectors of the economy, including sugar, the island's most important export. Nonetheless, Fidel Castro, son of a wealthy sugar plantation owner, led a successful popular insurrection that transformed Cuba into a Marxist socialist state just off the southern coast of the United States. Now, the armed revolt began disastrously. In 1953, the Cuban army defeated Castro and 123 of his supporters when they attacked two army barracks in what was their first major military operation. Castro himself was captured, sentenced to jail, and then released into exile. However, fortune shifted in 1956 when Castro slipped back into Cuba and succeeded in bringing together many opponents of the current regime in an armed nationalist insurgency dedicated to radical economic and social reform. Upon seizing power in 1959, Castro and his government acted decisively to implement their revolutionary agenda. Within a year, they had effectively redistributed 15% of the nation's wealth by granting land to the poor, increasing wages, and lowering rents. In the following year, the new government nationalized the property of both wealthy Cubans and U.S. corporations. And many Cubans, particularly among the elite, fled into exile. And quote-unquote, "the revolution," declared Castro, "is the dictatorship of the exploited against the exploiters." Now, economic and political pressure from the United States followed, culminating in the Bay of Pigs, a failed invasion of the island in 1961 by Cuban exiles with covert support from the U.S. government. American hostility pushed the revolutionary nationalist Castro closer to the Soviet Union and gradually began to think of himself and his revolution as Marxist. In response to Cuban pleas for support against American aggression, the Soviet Premier Khrushchev deployed nuclear weapons on the island, sparking the Cuban Missile Crisis. While the compromise reached between the two superpowers resulted in the withdrawal of the missiles, it did include assurances from the United States that it would not attack Cuba. In the decades that followed, Cuba sought to export its brand of revolution beyond its borders, especially in Latin America and Africa. Che Guevara, an Argentine who had fought in the Cuban Revolution, declared, quote, "Our revolution is endangering all American possessions in Latin America. We're telling these countries to make their own revolution," end quote. And Cuba supported revolutionary movements in many regions, however, none succeeded in creating a lasting Cuban-style regime. The legacy of the Cuban Revolution has been mixed. The new government devoted considerable resources to improving health and education on the island, and by the mid-1980s, Cuba possessed both the highest literacy rate and the lowest infant mortality rate in Latin America. Over the same period, life expectancy increased from 58 to 73 years, putting Cuba on a par with the United States. Living standards for most improved as well. Indeed, Cuba became a model for development in other Latin American countries. However, earlier promises to establish a truly democratic system never materialized. Castro declared in 1959 that elections were unneeded because, quote, this democracy has found its expression directly in the intimate union and identification of the government with the people, end quote. The state placed limits on free expression and arrested opponents or forced them into exile. And Cuba has also failed to achieve the economic development originally envisioned in the time of the revolution. Sugar remains its chief export crop. By the 1980s, Cuba had become almost as economically dependent on the Soviet Union as it had been upon the United States. Desperate consequences followed when the Cuban economy shrank by a third following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like communist experiments in the Soviet Union and Cuba experienced real improvements in living standards, especially for the poor, but these gains were accompanied by sharp restraints on personal freedoms and mixed results in the economy. Such have been the ambivalent outcomes of many revolutionary upheavals. All right, the Cold War and the superpowers. So the United States became leader of the West against communism after World War II. This was sustained by economy and increasing wealthy middle class. There's no physical destruction on their own soil, and most of the economy was pretty productive. The communist state usually were in turmoil. Stalin's crimes came to light in the mid-1950s, and reform movements were pushed in Hungary in 1956 to 1957, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Poland in the early 1980s against the Soviet-dominated communist governments. There's also growing conflict among the communist countries of Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia. Yugoslavia rejected Soviet domination. Soviet invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia were sent to crush these reform movements. In the early 1980s, Poland was also threatened with invasion, and there's brutal suppression of reform that tarnished the image of Soviet communism. It gave credence to Western views of the Cold War as a struggle between tyranny and freedom. And there's sharp opposition between the U.S. and China stemming from nuclear arms. China went to war against a communist Vietnam in 1979, and Vietnam invaded communist Cambodia in the late 1970s. And world communism then reached its greatest extent in the 1970s. And that concludes our study of East versus West, the global divide and Cold War. I will see you guys again for Toward Freedom.